This afternoon, I'm going to talk about something I've talked about before, but I don't think for a long time, which is the Upanisa Sutta. It's a variation on the dependent arising that Bhikkhu Bodhi has called the transcendental dependent arising, in that the ordinary dependent arising, the 12 steps, demonstrates the ordinary operation of samsaric existence. It's a detailed explanation of first and second noble truth, and by itself it doesn't show a way out of suffering. But the transcendental dependent arising, the Upanisa Sutta, details a path out of dukkha, out of suffering. The sutta begins with a statement that liberation occurs when one relinquishes attachment to the five khandha. The five khandha being body, feelings, mental formations, perceptions, and consciousness, the aggregates of being. And attachment to these, clinging to these, that keeps us in a state of suffering, keeps us in the samsaric becoming. We can all fall into this, unless we're arahants. We will again and again fall into clinging and attachment to the aggregates. Attachment to mental formations is a particular case that's very easy to fall into, taking our own mental fabrications seriously and giving them weight and importance and being led astray by them. Or we can be attached to feelings, pleasant feeling, unpleasant feeling, making an issue of it. Or we're attached to the body, the bodily well-being and comfort and so forth. Attachment to sense impressions, pleasant sense impressions and not unpleasant ones. And all these forms of attachment are what keeps us in samsaric becoming, and relinquishment of them is what releases us. So after this short statement, then the Buddha explains first in reverse order and then in forward order. He explains the path leading out of suffering. In the forward order, the departure from the ordinary dependent origination begins after birth. In the ordinary dependent origination, the formula is because of becoming birth, because of birth, old age, and death. But in this case, old age and death is replaced by dukkha, suffering. So it takes the more general kind of existential description of our experience. Our experience is dukkha. And the way out, the beginning point of departure, of not going around the cycle again, is the element of saddha, faith or confidence. Now, beginning with the experience of dukkha, and this is, as we often emphasize, this is universal reality. This is the state of beings in existence, is that there will be dukkha. There will be some form of dissatisfaction, some form of imperfection and suffering. There are different ways that beings in the world attempt to deal with the reality of suffering. For some beings, for some time, they can just disregard it. If they haven't had yet in their life gross manifestations of dukkha, then they can pretend to look at the world through rose-colored glasses and kind of pretend everything is fine. This is impossible to sustain in the reality of human existence. Everybody in the course of their lifetime, they experience many lesser and some greater forms of suffering. Illness, loss of loved ones, disappointment. This is just a common human fate. And attempting to pretend it isn't so, that just won't last. That naivete will, the universe will shake you out of it. It's not possible to sustain that. I was looking at Bhikkhu Bodhi's essay on this sutta, and he makes a point that at this point, when beings are confronted with suffering, they attempt to deal with it in different ways, and he cites two which correspond roughly to the false views of eternalism and annihilationism. On the one hand, you can take a theological approach to the reality of suffering and say it's God's plan, it's a mystery, God did it this way, this is for the greater good, it's in God's hands. And this is, there's actually a technical name for this in Christian theology. It's called theodicy, the problem of evil, the problem of suffering. It's really not, and it's telling that, this is something that the Christian theologians have been working on, since Christianity started, and not really come up with a definitive answer for it. It's not something that we can really sustain. It becomes impossible to imagine how it could be in God's plan that a baby is born with spina bifida, or a small child comes down with leukemia. There's no possible way of sustaining that view, really. The annihilationist view takes the idea the universe is essentially random. Now, this is basically the view that shit happens. There's no way of explaining it or dealing with it. This is just the way the universe is. And this view leads to nihilism, and is expressed in individuals either with attempts to escape into wild sensuality, hedonism, which always leads to more suffering, or to black despair and depression. So this is no answer either. The Buddha's answer is the middle path between the two extremes of eternalism and annihilationism. Is the middle way is the dependent origination, that things arise according to causes and conditions, that for any individual event that occurs, for good or for ill, there's prior causation, and part of the causal factor is our own volition, our karmic actions that we've made. And the Buddha's teaching also includes the third noble truth, that there is an end to suffering. And it's really this point that until one has glimpsed nibbana for oneself, this is really the one point in the Buddha's teaching that has to be taken on faith. There's no possible logical argument or evidence for nibbana. There's only the possible immediate experience of it. It can be experienced by oneself. So having this faith that on the one hand things make sense, they arise according to causes and conditions, which is actually something you can accept by experience and reason, it makes sense. And the other hand, that there is an unconditioned. There is that which is not this. There is a way out of this mess. No? And this faith, or saddha, or confidence, is the leaping forward of the mind. It's been compared to a map guiding one through the desert. Or a more modern analogy somebody came up with is like the headlights of your car illuminating the path ahead. It gives you the courage to begin crossing over. It takes a degree of courage, kind of a warrior spirit to make it through. The temptation is always there to fall back on what we know, our comfort in the sense basis, and not to push on, and which requires relinquishment. It requires stepping out into the abyss. And faith is what gives us the ability to do that. I think, as a general principle, that's true, and I also think that in the case of beings that have a great deal of suffering, or at this point in time are experiencing a great deal of suffering, faith is really the only lifeline possible. That no other positive quality really can be found in a state of great suffering. But you might be able to find that glimmer of faith. There's a hope that there's a way out of this. When faith grows in the being, and he has confidence in the path, then this leads to happiness. This is called in the Sutta Pamoja. There's a happiness. The faith leads to happiness. There's a joy that arises. And this is a good principle to know, that if you're trying to lift yourself out of black spirits, dark mind states, faith is the way to arouse that joy. And this is aroused in spiritual practice of the form of devotional practice, like chanting or tending to an altar, beautifying, cleaning the shrine, chanting suttas. These are things that arouse faith and joy. And you can see this with as a practical manifestation. You can see this in religious paths that are heavy on the devotional aspects, what they call in Hindu tradition, they call it bhakti. You can see that the paths that emphasize that a lot, the people in them tend to be very joyous, and to the point of being sort of giddy, spaced out with it. This arouses joy, pamoja. And pamoja matures into piti, which is the rapture that is cited as a jhana factor. This is the deeper joy that manifests as the mind settles into greater stability. And it usually has, although it should be understood, this is a mental factor, it does have bodily correlates in terms of sensations, feelings in the body very commonly. And the highest form of it, and there's many different forms listed, the highest form is they call uplifting piti, where you feel like you're being lifted, floating. You feel your body feels so light and unencumbered. And this leads to the next step is passaddhi, is tranquility. It's a peacefulness. The piti has a powerful cleansing, purifying aspect. It sort of washes away the knots, the defilements, and leaves you feeling peaceful. Passaddhi of the mind and passaddhi of the body. There's a feeling of well-being, of being at ease and at peace. Passaddhi is one of the bojjhanga, one of the enlightenment factors. And it's something that's very useful to cultivate at all times, that it's so much more beneficial to be peaceful than it is to be excited or agitated upset. To just be at peace in all circumstances is a very good skill to develop, to find this inner peacefulness, this tranquility, passaddhi. The next step this leads to is sukha, is bliss. This is a deeper form of happiness yet. Now, this is the third factor in this list that is in some way could be translated as happiness. This is the deepest happiness. Sukha is the oceanic, peaceful happiness, the blissful feeling. It doesn't really have a bodily expression except that the body's at ease, it's without distress, but there's a mental feeling of expansion and happiness, great peace. In one place, in one of the Abhidhamma texts, there's a simile that's given to show the degree of difference between piti and sukha. It says if there were a man wandering in the wilderness, wandering in the wilderness in the Indian context usually means the desert. He's wandering in the wilderness and he's dry and hot and thirsty. And he comes across another traveler who says to him, "Oh, you're almost there. Just over that rise, there's quite a pleasant oasis. There's a lake and there's fruit trees and there's a nice shady place to sit after you bathe." And he says, "Oh, thank you very much." And he goes over the hill to the lake and he bathes in the water and drinks to his fill and eats some fruit. And he lies down under a tree resting. It said the feeling when he first heard the news that there's an oasis over the hill, that's piti. And the feeling he had after he'd bathed and he's lying down under the tree, that's sukha. So you see, the first case, there's excitement. Oh boy, there's a lake over the rise, and the last one, he's already satiated with the drink and had something to eat. Now he's just resting and at ease. This is happy. This is sukha. So the experience of sukha allows the mind to come to rest and attain a strong degree of samadhi. Samadhi is the stability, the non-wavering, the stillness of mind. There's a great strength of mind. The mind is not agitated, not moving, not flitting about from object to object, but has this great stability and the ability to really take an object. So samadhi developed as an exercise culminates in jhana, absorption state, the complete stability of mind. As a quality, it's also required for proper development of insight, of vipassana. To really take an object, the mind has to be still. It can't be disturbed. This is what happens that why people find it difficult to do insight or vipassana is that the objects disturb the mind. That one is not able to take the object from a place of samadhi, from a place of passaddhi. And this is what we're working to. This is what you should be working towards, where you can take an object, whatever the object is, whether it's pleasant or painful or neutral, and not let it disturb the mind, not agitate the mind. When one is able to do this, it leads to the next stage, which is is called knowledge and vision of things as they are. Yata Bhuta Jnana Dasana. Knowledge and vision of things as they are. And this is seeing according to reality and not otherwise. So this is not done if there's attachment, if one hasn't relinquished attachment to the aggregates. If one is seeking comfort, if one is seeking pleasant abidings, then there's a desire in the mind, and you're not seeing things as they actually are. You're seeing them through a filter of personal desire, personal, self-reference, and not seeing things in an objective, clear way. You know? This is a painful sensation. This is a pleasant sensation. This is a memory. This is a thought. Seeing them in their own nature as they actually are. This requires a high degree of equanimity and a high degree of clarity. There's nothing fuzzy or indeterminate about the mind that's seeing things as they actually are. It's a wide awake, clear, sharp mind. But it's a mind that's at peace and equanimous. And seeing things in their own nature as they actually are, it leads to the next stage, which is nibbida. Now this is one of those words in Pali that has bedeviled translators. It used to be frequently translated as revulsion, which is has all sorts of bad connotations, although you can see why they chose it. So it's more commonly translated now as disenchantment, which isn't very literal, but it sort of gets to the point better, I think. It's one of these words that's just, first of all, best to understand there is no English equivalent. Nibbida is the stage where you have seen through the aggregates, seen through the formations, and are abandoning in a deep way. In a very core way, you're able to abandon the phenomena. Now, it's important to understand this is not yet liberation. You've not gone cross to the other side, but you are letting go. You're beginning to see the undesirability, the dissatisfaction with the samsaric phenomena. There's a list. I've printed it out because it's 40 elements to the list, and I won't remember them. But it's a list that's found in the Visuddhimagga describing the way the mind sees the five aggregates at this point, with strong knowledge and vision of things as they are, and the arising of nibbida. We begin to see the objects, the sankharas, as impermanent, as painful, as a disease, a boil, a dart, a calamity, an affliction, as alien. It's alien. This is an important one to think about. It's like the sankharas arising, they're alien, they're other. It's not me, not mine. As disintegrating, as a plague, a disaster, a terror, a menace, as fickle, perishable, unenduring, as no protection, no shelter, no refuge. This is important too, because up until the mind begins to see through them, the formations are seen as a refuge. You fall back on what you know, and pleasant sensations, pleasant feelings, happy thoughts. These are seen as falsely seen, illusorily seen as a refuge. There's nothing secure there. No shelter, no refuge. As empty, vain, void, not self. As danger, as subject to change, as having no core, as the root of calamity, as murderous, as due to be annihilated, as subject to cankers, as formed, as Mara's bait, as subject to birth, as subject to aging, as subject to illness, as subject to death, as subject to sorrow, as subject to lamentation, as subject to despair, as subject to defilement. So any sankhara whatsoever that arises in the mind is seen in this way. This is nibbida. And this is a radical turning in the mind, because what's kept us going in samsara for countless lifetimes is always chasing after the next shiny thing. The mind is always leaping ahead to the next object. This is going to be something really good. I want this next thing, and then you grab it and it just falls apart in your hand, and oh well, this thing over here is going to be different. And the mind's been doing that, playing that game that cannot be won for lifetime after lifetime. And when one begins to really see the nature of the phenomena, then this is nibbida, and it's possible to begin letting go. So this is why the translation disenchantment has some merit, because it's like the spell, Mara's spell is dissolving, and you're having clarity. This is not entirely, it's actually far from a pleasant abiding, just being in nibbida. And as in the more expanded, detailed explanation of the path of insight has been developed, from in Visuddhimagga and in the Burmese tradition. They talk about stages of terror, of misery, of knowledge of misery, knowledge of despair. This is kind of like what this really represents is the rose-colored glasses are coming off completely, and you see, oh, this is samsara. This is really bad. Everything's falling apart. The body's rotting away underneath me, and the mind is nothing but a fickle, flickering thing. And there's no refuge, no security anywhere in this samsaric conditioning. And it takes, at this point is when it really takes internal stamina, courage to push through and not retreat back to the false security of the near shore, and just to step out into the raging torrent and cross to the far shore. The next stage after this, one comes to the stage of viraga, or dispassion. That's a very literal translation. That's what viraga means, the cutting of passion. The impulse to create samsara is burned out. It's not present. So one's crossed through from nibbida, and the sigh of relief, it just abandons the passion of becoming. And that leads to vimutti, liberation. The liberation from samsara. And to the final stage, which is jnana asawa kaya, the knowledge of the cutting of the root defilements, or full awakening. So these last two stages could be also called path and fruit, magga phala. And this is the mind entering into the unconditioned. Magga is the path, it's the eightfold path, which occurs at two levels. There's the mundane path, which is the 8 path factors as we practice them, as we endeavor to practice them all the time in ordinary life. But then at this moment, at the path moment, is a particular event in the mind when the 8 path factors become transmuted from the mundane to the supramundane, from the lokiya to the lokatura level, which means they're all aligned now to nibbana. So one's right view of nibbana, right intention or thought of nibbana, and so on. One of the Thai forest monks in one of his writings, he or transcribed talks, was talking about this point, and I thought he had a very interesting insight. Is uh, take an example, the path factor of right livelihood, which we understand on the mundane level is how you make your living. So in a sense, it's how you feed yourself, how you provide for your physical nutriment. On the supramundane level, it's how you feed the mind, and the mind is feeding on nibbana. Nibbana becomes the nutriment of the mind, and this is the only right livelihood in the transcendental level, is full alignment with nibbana. So the path then aligns every aspect of the mind towards the unconditioned. And then in the next moment is the realization of the fruit, which is the full experience of the unconditioned. And one has broken through. And this all happens beginning with that spark of faith, and then it happens through this relinquishment, non-attachment to the aggregates, being able to get beyond the attachment to pleasant abiding, pleasant feeling, comfort of the body, pleasant feeling in the mind, getting beyond all that, abandoning, relinquishing. In the final passage in the sutta, the Buddha then gives another metaphor, and he says this is like the rain falling in the mountains, and little rivulets form on the ground, and they come together and make streams, and the streams come together and make small tributary rivers, and the small tributary rivers come together and make mighty rivers, and the mighty rivers empty into the ocean. So the idea is that from this kind of small beginning, it picks up power and steam. It picks up energy and comes together, and there's gathers force. So this whole process of emerging from samsara picks up its own momentum as long as you're on the right path. The rivulets will come together. So, kind of summary, a few points to bear in mind. The emphasis in the suttas, first of all, is on relinquishment, and it's also important to note the importance of joy and happiness in this path. For one who is attached, clinging to the aggregates, clinging to bodily comfort, clinging to sense pleasures, then it seems like relinquishment seems like a suffering. It seems like a painful thing, like a great sacrifice, where it's actually understood properly as a source of great joy. When you're not dependent on these externalities, then the mind can open into joy. And the joy deepens like the rivers flowing down the mountain, and it allows one to break the dam of the defilements and of samsaric becoming, and to realize the unconditioned.